All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Working Capital, the real estate podcast. I have a special guest today, Jon Love. Jon is the founder and CEO of KingSett Capital, Canada's leading private equity real estate investment business. Jon was formerly the president and CEO of Oxford Properties Group. Oxford businesses invest in, develop, and manage over 150 million square feet of office. In 2018, Jon was appointed a member of the Order of Canada, and for those of you outside of Canada, that is a fellowship that recognizes the outstanding merit of Canadians and I believe non-Canadians who make a major difference to Canada through lifelong contribution. He's navigated through several recessions in his career and now draws from those experiences as we find ourselves in a unique time in 2021 today. Jon, how you doing?
Doing great. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being part of the show. Like I said before the show, I heard a few different podcasts that you were on. Obviously, we've met in person before through your various roles. Something that really stuck out to me was your background in the real estate industry, starting with your father. So maybe for those that aren't familiar, you could talk a little bit about your father and kind of his impact on your career today.
So my father founded Oxford in 1960 in Edmonton, and with an idea, no capital, and some skills, built quite an outstanding platform. He was a great entrepreneur. There were several times where, he would give me a piece of advice that really resonated. And I'll just give you one example. When I started my business career as a retail stockbroker, and, I was out doing my thing 2 or 3 months in, and of course it's slow. He says to me one night, he says, "So how's it going?" And I said, "Well, it's a bit slow." And he said, "Well, maybe when you see someone, you should have an idea." Now that single moment then imprinted, my understanding of value to someone else, which is you have to have something to contribute to the conversation. Out of that, I built a very successful practice as a stockbroker. And then, ultimately through my Oxford, now KingSett days, it always resonates with me that when I see someone else, I should have an idea, or God forbid, two.
Right on. In terms of your background in the business, I think you've mentioned before your father was a developer of businesses, and that had an impact of you. What is it like coming from shoes to fill that are large like that? There's a number of people in various industries that are filling shoes of their mentors, of their fathers, their mothers. What was that like?
So I would say he was primarily a developer of people. Because where he had an outstanding talent was in recognizing where someone might have skill sets applicable to a job, moving them along perhaps faster than many people thought. But he built some great leaders in our industry through his tenure. As for the child of a successful parent, I'd rather be the child of a successful parent than the other way around, or in other words, not be a child of a non-successful parent. I think there's many things that are great lessons there, and there's also some things you have to learn yourself. And the most important lesson that I did is I had to go do something on my own, not to prove to anybody else, but to prove to myself that in fact I had value as an individual. So as a retail stockbroker, you were graded every day, because every day you got your commission statement from the day before. And it was, a hyper, you eat what you kill, right? I mean, so you know exactly where you rank. And I had the good fortune of being in the right place at the right time, Edmonton, late 70s, oil and gas boom, so on and so forth, and ranked nationally quite well at a very young age. So when I left Scotia McLeod and went and worked for Oxford, I could do so knowing that I didn't have anything to prove to anybody, and I wasn't competing with my father. I had already proved to myself, and therefore didn't have to prove to others, that I was okay as it was. So I focused at the job at hand. And, people were, I started at the lowest rung humanly possible, which is, the right thing to do. And after a very few number of weeks, people sort of forgot the fact of what my last name was, because I was focused on getting the job done. And I was no different than anybody else, and I didn't want anything special. And I just wanted to get the job done. So there are ways that we can all make that work.
So from retail stockbroker, you come back into the real estate fold, and I believe as a client coordinator, if correct me if I'm wrong. And what was that transition like, and how did that launch you into the trajectory that was real estate?
So real estate, being a retail stockbroker, the most important thing you need to learn is how to communicate to other people with varying levels of sophistication. And bearing in mind that as a 20-something, that I knew less than half my clients. So it was about providing service, building relationships, listening to opportunities, and so on and so forth. So it was a tremendous training ground. When I started leasing space as a leasing coordinator, the biggest adjustment was how long it took for someone to actually commit to a piece of space. Because I was in a world where I'd pitch a stock idea to you, and you'd either say yes or no on the phone. All of a sudden, here I am trying to do leases, and sometimes they take a week or 3. I was going to lose my mind. But that intensity and naivety actually played pretty well for me. So it got me off to a very solid start. And I love leasing. I still do leasing today. It's terrific.
Yeah. Yeah, I tell, regardless of if you're in capital markets or other areas in our industry, I find leasing, it's definitely the bread and butter of our business in a lot of ways.
Absolutely.
So you come into this real estate side, and what are the first few years, coming out of that role as a coordinator and doing larger projects and larger deals? How did that evolve into kind of where you ended up in your career? Because at that time, I would assume it would have been now in the 80s. Who would have thought what was bound to happen 10 years later? What was that next chapter like?
So my early days, I started in 1980, where, was leasing. And I was fortunate enough, my first leasing assignments were small buildings on Bay Street in Toronto, and all the customers were 500 square feet. And because they were 500 square feet, I was kind of let to go on my own. Well, I learned a ton of lessons because these were all sophisticated, thoughtful people. And that was a tremendous start. And then I was leasing larger things, then into some development role. Then I'm, a time in St. Paul, Minnesota, a time in Calgary. And having that done, then I got into sort of senior leadership back in Toronto, setting up for, the real estate, collapse of the early 90s, which was a terrific time if you had 3 things, which I had. One is you had to be relatively naive. Second is you had to be young enough to have the energy so you knew that, nothing fatal was going to happen. And, the third thing we needed was optimism. And you know what? We were optimistic we could make, a good situation out of a difficult situation. So it was the workaround, the work through, because we didn't really work out, the work through of the 91 to 94 period was, some of the highlight of my career.
And what was it about that time, or individual maybe deals or restructurings? Was there something specific, or was it the general environment that you knew you were going through something unique?
Well, it was the lessons of the day. A. B. It was triangulating an employment group of 250 people whose livelihoods were depending on Oxford, and Oxford was, smallish relative to the other peers and heavily discounted as someone who could survive. And in fact, we were able to navigate our way through the chicane without a CCAA or whatever, because we were able to get a team who could motivate an organization to do the best we could do. And through transparency and, honoring commitments and all these, values-based actions, we got our way through and got to the other side. And it was a great experience. And my business partners at the time were talented. We worked together really well, and is a key to the success of that strategy.
So clearly not every company fared as well as your team at that time. And I think you mentioned an anecdote before about, going to lenders. And I think it was your time at Oxford where you said the lenders told you that there's 3 type of people they lend to. Maybe you could expand a little on that.
So the first time that we didn't have enough money to make a mortgage payment, and this is pretty terrifying. And, I've told this story before, but, I got in a cab to go to Midtown Toronto. It was 36 degrees or warmer. I was all sweating, walk in the office of the CIO, sit down. And I said, look, we can't make this payment for these reasons, but we could do this. And if we could do that, could we do this? And we sort of thought we had a creative idea. It was the best we could do. As I'm leaving, he said to me, "Thanks for coming by." And of course, thanks was not the response that I had expected. So I stopped and I said, "Thanks." And he said, "Look, we've got three kinds of borrowers. The first kind borrows money and pays it back. We like them the most. Second kind borrows money and is either not open with us or dishonest with us or doesn't respect us or whatever. We will go out of our way to hurt them. The third kind, people that have a problem, come in and tell us they have a problem, propose some solutions. We work with them and we'll work with you." And that set the tone and strategy for Oxford to work through the difficult times.
And do you see parallels over the last year with that aspect, just given the fact that, we are in a situation where, depending on where you are, which vertical you're in, there's a lot of people hurting. There's, defaults, although haven't gone up particularly definitely not as much as back then. But do you see those parallels? And if so, how would you navigate that as somebody that was maybe where you were at that time today?
The facts on the ground today are totally different. The facts there were it had led up to a significant oversupply of commercial real estate. And that ultimately crashed. Rental rates went from $36 to $3. I mean, like it was Armageddon. Today, we have a health crisis. The secret to working through the 90s was building relationships and making sure that everybody was informed of what's going on. Today, you can't even see somebody. But we also know that, when the health crisis is over, we'll be back to some semblance of what we were doing before, because they're not excesses. I mean, obviously the government has got substantial fiscal excesses that it's got to deal with, but that's another story. The fact is that if you look at the real estate leaders, like most people are paying rent, some people aren't. We're helping all sorts of smaller tenants, get through this period. Most renters, apartment renters are paying rent. I mean, so there is no obvious dislocation. The dislocation is not as much in the real estate space as it is in a lot of small businesses, particularly people like the restaurant business, who've been told you can open, you can close, you can open, you can close, you can open these rules. Now let's change rules to those. Like that is very, very difficult space. And, for those people, I would say they, to the extent they can, they've got two stakeholder groups. They've got their shareholders, which may be themselves. They've got their lenders, their bank, and they've got their landlord, who's also their bank. And the ones that are talking to us and say, look, I've got a problem. I have a plan. I'd like your help. We're working with them. And you know what? People that are being difficult or whatever, you know what? We're not working with those. But people that can think forward and say, I need your help, we'll help.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of the current state of the economy. But before we do, I'd love to hear just in the early 2000s when there is the sale of Oxford, that experience leading up to it. I know that, you've mentioned before that you took some downtime after that and then came back after some disconnect from electronics. But yeah, maybe you could talk a little bit about that sale. What was that like, that experience for you?
So, Oxford had grown, beyond what we might have thought, and to the point where it was limited by Competition Act for expansion in sort of big integrated downtown complexes in Canada. So we had a basic decision to make. We had, and we call it, we had to go long or we had to go wide. So had to stay in Canada and go to other asset classes, or had to go to other geography in the same asset class. And it was my view that I wasn't the right CEO for either strategy. So we went to, and for a bunch of reasons. So we went to OMERS and see if they would engage in a transaction. And, that took a period of time. And ultimately in the August long weekend of 2001, they made an offer, we made a deal, all good. It went firm and binding on September 10th, 2001. And, one day later, the deal would have been off. So anyway, it was, a highlight in many respects. Everybody was happy with the deal. And I was, quite pleased. I think we had done our job over the previous 6 or 7 years, coming out of a very difficult period of time to creating $1 billion of shareholder value, which, we were very proud of. The management team basically stayed. I felt it was right for me to move on. My shadow was not helpful. And so I did that. And my wife and I kind of went dark and disappeared for 6 months, had a terrific time, and came back in the spring of 2002 and started KingSett.
Right on. So we've had other CEOs come on the show and owners, and they've talked about this idea of wanting to be invisible to a certain extent as the CEO of a company, like run properly, but it shouldn't be their face. Is that a view you subscribe to?
Right. Well, to be invisible, I'm I'm hardly invisible. I think of it differently, which is there's a role that as a CEO you play, and every CEO likely has a different role because they have different skills and aptitudes. I'm very good at very little, and that very little I focus on, and I've got a great team that is very good at everything else, which makes the machine work.
So the transition from Oxford to KingSett, was that, just having talked to or heard the story before, to me, I feel like any person that does something for so long and is passionate about what they do, that's what they find their joy in. And once that's gone, was there a void at that time? Is that what kind of prompted you to get back into one of those roles?
Well, what you quickly realize is that, every spare moment, for the last 20 years, I would have been thinking about an Oxford problem. But now there's no more Oxford problem. And so your mind sort of says, well, I got to go think about something else, because you have the same amount of creativity, energy that you had before. So I channeled that in a diary. So I'd never written in a diary before. I started writing in a diary and started doing other things. But after the 6 months off, it never, I was 47 at the time. It was never in my screen that I would, retire in a conventional sense. I mean, I had the financial, situation I could retire, but that would be pretty boring for me. So hence the idea to start a business, which of course is terrifying, because remember, in the Oxford platform, and the larger it gets, you need a cell phone, you call someone, you have a cell phone. You need to travel, you call someone, you travel. All of a sudden, you're on your own, and you have no people, and you have no infrastructure, and every decision is the only decision being made that day. So it's starting with a blank piece of paper, shuttling between two coffee shops is a much different construct than running a business, which at the time had 3,000 people and blah, blah, blah.
So just to back up, in terms of the Oxford, there was an actual statute on the books? It was a Competition Act challenge that basically meant you had to go long or go wide?
Well, we were at the point where our market share we had 25% of the office in Toronto, 40% at Edmonton, 30% in Calgary, et cetera, et cetera. So, increasingly there was kind of no obvious way to have a meaningful growth strategy for the business unless it was going away from office or away from those cities. And, we had worked for 10 years to get better and better at less and less until I felt we were very much best of class in running integrated downtown office complexes. But it's not that easy to then snap your fingers and say, okay, now we're going to do these other things. In other geographies or other asset classes. So the machine, and I was really proud of the machine that the guys had built, was very effective at doing that. And that had been our sole focus, and I think part of the reason we were so effective. But to then change that strategy was tricky. So that that sort of gave rise to moving on.
So what was it at KingSett that you did that you maybe thought that you wanted to do more that you maybe weren't able to do at Oxford? Or were there aspects of KingSett that you're gonna tackle differently and you had the ability to do so?
So when you start with a blank piece of paper, the advantage is the sheet's blank. So it starts with going back to the relationships I've had at Oxford, trying to understand where there might be an opportunity to collaborate and so on and so forth. Out of that came the idea to create an opportunity fund, what we call a growth fund. And that had the scope to really be a lot freer. I said a few things. I mean, we had a very narrow strategy. I said I'd never have more than 12 people, life happens. But with the kind support of those stakeholders, we're able to put together a powerful team of people, capital, and start to build a business.
So when you talk to Canadian companies today, like I think it was on a podcast recently with Clearbank, and they were talking about the idea of thinking globally first, and just understanding the implications of starting a business and being global. With Canadian real estate, I find that it seems to be, maybe it's changing, but somewhat different in that a lot of it is localized. I mean, real estate is in general. But for larger Canadian companies, is the future staying within Canada? Is it going, exposing yourself to the States or globally? What's your view on that?
So, I don't think there's one answer, but I'll tell you that I'd start with that real estate amongst every business is the most dramatically local business. And it's local because the facts on the ground are critical to interpret correctly and are so different, even in our own country. If you look at downtown Montreal, downtown Vancouver, and downtown Toronto, totally different. And they've got totally different drivers and so on and so forth. Now, there are obviously global real estate businesses. They are few and far between. And because typically, if you look at the US, most businesses are regional for the same reason. It's when I look at what we think our competitive advantage is, it's micro market knowledge and intense relationships, both of which, you leave if you cross a border, because, I have a lot of access to a lot of things in Canada. I'm a total stranger in the US. The access that we have to capital here is quite significant. In the US, no one cares. And so it goes. And as far as for market knowledge, I've heard of Columbus. I'm just not sure what state it's in. Whereas, if you think in terms of the Canadian market, someone in our office has managed, owned, leased, appraised, or valued every building over 100,000 square feet in Canada. So it's a totally different set of facts. Now, often people say to me, why don't you look at the US? And it's a bit said in the context of, because surely you can't be successful. You just stay in Canada. And, I'm a short, fat kid from Edmonton. It doesn't really matter to me. So the key thing is that you really have to think through where you think you've got competitive advantages, and then you've got to press those. And there are 52 smarter guys in Chicago than we would ever be. So why would we compete in that market? Now, there's still lots of smart guys in Canada, but we've got a big strategic platform here, which can create a lot of value. So that's what we'll do. I think globally you'll continue to see, I think, the most success in real estate be national. French companies are French companies, British companies are British companies, and there are Canadian enterprises in Europe and they've done great business. So it's not that it can't be done. I just don't think it's typically the norm. Technology is different. Technology doesn't recognize borders. Technology doesn't have borders. Most or many consumer products, can't rely on a Canada-only strategy because there's not enough scale. So other businesses do, have to think about different capabilities and different competitive moats. Whereas the competitive moat for Canadian real estate is access to deals and capital, which is a huge moat, which is why you don't see a lot of, or really any, or you don't see many non-Canadian operators in Canada.
Yeah. You know, like I said before the show, I follow some of your posts on LinkedIn, and I wanted to ask you, that I got the chance here to, over the last year, you know, we've seen the relationship between us and the U.S., and we've seen some of the implications of PPE and Keystone. And I think one of the posts, or, you know, the topic was just in regard to how we don't interact with other provinces as much as we should. Perhaps you can expand a bit on that.
Well, I'll break it into two pieces. First of all, the nationalism that we've faced with our American neighbor is regrettable. I mean, there was a time where, you know, we were much closer and integrated in all sorts of our lives, and that is dissipated, not just under Trump. It was also under Obama and before. So this is an ongoing trend. One of the issues Canada has to think about is that, you know, we need food security, energy security, and, as we know, healthcare security. And we don't have any of those because we have regional trade agreements. Food goes north and south in the West and the East. So we export in the West and we import in the East. Same thing with energy. Well, both are, you know, suspect or can be potentially interrupted by a foreign actor. And the reason this happens is we don't have free trade in Canada. We've got freer trade with our American friends than we do with our Canadian neighbors, which makes no sense. And, you know, if we could accomplish one thing, we would say through three things. Let's have interprovincial free trade. Let's have national food security, so food going east and west. And then let's have national energy security. Let's build an energy corridor on Canadian soil that moves electricity from the east to the west, moves uranium and petrochemicals from petroleum products from the west to the east. I don't know why in Alberta we're selling natural gas to our US friends for $1.80 an MCF, and our maritime provinces are buying it for $6 to $8 from their US neighbors. How can that possibly make sense? And on it goes. And here we are with Governor Whitmer in Michigan threatening to close down Line 3, Enbridge Line 3, which is now gas comes to Ontario from Alberta. Well, if that gets shut down, like, that's a real problem. We may complain about a lot of things, but, you know, there's only 3-day food supply. And when Cargill shut down High River with COVID, we were 1 day away from having a beef shortage in Eastern Canada. You know, we've seen in the last year propane shortages where, you know, virtually parts of Eastern Quebec in the Maritimes were 1 day away from running out of energy. When you don't have food and energy security, when you're in a country with massive abundance, it's an infrastructure failure. And that would be a big national project. Free trade, and let's move goods and services back and forth across our great country.
Yeah, the West and East, I've heard this time and time again. In another life, I worked at Enbridge for a number of years, and that was definitely part of the conversation, and it's demystifying in a lot of ways, mystifying in a lot of ways. In terms of our reaction, if we step forward to 2020, 2021, our reaction initially to the pandemic, the lockdown, our response, what was your view generally as a country? How do you think we did? So,
I'd say that it was, unprecedented, has been used an unprecedented number of times. But, I'll say that I think we all need to give our political leaders a lot of leeway in those, or particularly the first 6 months, because it was nobody knew what to do about anything. Okay, I think that as we find ourselves today, my frustration is we have a private sector vaccine delivery system that has delivered flu vaccines, what we call the flu shot, to 20 plus million Canadians for 20 or 30 years. Why don't we use that distribution chain to distribute the vaccine? Number one. Number two is we've shown the challenges in public sector procurement with all the difficulties of Health Canada trying to buy vaccines and apparently not having perfect contracts. So why don't we again encourage the private sector to give a hand to help procure these vaccines? Because we need to get more and we need to get them in arms faster, because to get ahead of the variants, everybody's got to get vaccinated once, because you'll have to get vaccinated again in the fall. And we can't be still doing the first time vax. So, and I think vaccines on a annual, maybe twice a year basis are here with us, are with us for some time. So we have an infrastructure. The existing drugstore, pharmacy infrastructure can administer today 3 million Canadians a week. That infrastructure exists. I don't know why we need the federal government or the provincial government to replicate that infrastructure. They've got the systems where you can book online, and they've got all the outlets, and they're all set up. They just need the vaccine. So the federal government, in my view, should be laser focused on getting more vaccine faster, and the provincial government should be focused on getting it in the hands of the shoppers, the Rexalls, the IGAs, whatever, and just let them go at it. So easy for me to say. These are tough choices. It's a very difficult set of facts. But my biggest issue is we have private sector infrastructure that knows how to do this stuff, and we should use it.
And what do you think is that? What do you think they're missing there on that piece? Is it just is it a coordination problem at this point?
Well, I mean, the fact is that there is great skepticism at the senior health bureaucrats of the private sector, and that leads to them to say, well, we have to do it our way, and our way is different. So it's just, in a crisis, our number one job should be putting needles in arms, full stop. And no matter how fast we can do it, it's not fast enough.
Yeah.
So, lockdowns and all these other things, they've proven themselves to be ineffective. We've had them before. You cannot lock everybody down unless you put a guard in front of everybody's house. And so, it is, obviously Premier Ford's got himself in a hell of a mess, because he said he's going to have random police checks. And the police said, well, hold it, we're not doing that. And then he said, well, we're not going to, shut down playgrounds. And people said, well, we never said that. So we're now in this, whatever happened in the first 6 months, I give people a lot of leeway.
Yep.
Whatever's happening to now, I'm a little bit more tough to get along with. So I think, the message should be listen to the scientists, leverage the private sector.
Yeah. And on that note, you've talked before about how you think it's, I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but I think, it comes off that business people have a duty or an obligation to engage in the political debate, or at least put forward their views. Labor does it in a way, and we often see that business people are a little bit shy to do it. And why do you think that is? Why do you think as business people, people that are leaders of these great companies in the US or Canada don't step up on some of these fronts?
So leaders of a lot of the big public businesses, run a bit of a tightrope. Meaning they're always operating with some relationships with government. They've got consumer groups and unions, employee groups. They've got customers that think, on the left, they think on the right, and they're kind of anxious not to upset anyone. But I think there is a role of business leadership to sort of outline a thought process, which, and from my perspective, I'm not trying to convince someone that I'm right or wrong. It's not the point. I'm trying to give another perspective. So at least someone can say that's interesting and I can think about that. And if you think about vaccine rollout, and why doesn't the government leverage the private sector health vaccine distribution system that already exists? So people can say, well, people can say whatever they want, right? But at least I think that's important. And I think you've seen the bank CEOs over the last year or so been more vocal about issues that are important to them. And we've seen business leaders in the past when, the elections that were basically fought on GST, and then the second Mulroney election was fought on free trade. I may have had that backwards, but either way, a lot of business leaders did lean in heavily there and say, here's what we think this means to us as Canadians and to you as citizens. And I think increasingly, we have to, as business leaders, express hopefully as nonpartisan as possible. And I mean, for me, I've voted Liberal, I've voted Conservative. I haven't quite crossed the line to NDP, but it's not impossible. Yeah. So because I feel responsible to policies, not parties. And that's why I've moved around. So I'd like to say, for me, I'm a bit of a centrist, because I think what's in my personal best interest is that every Canadian has the opportunity to have access to reasonable healthcare, reasonable education, and has a reasonable prospect of achieving what their dreams were. Because people with hope are great neighbors.
So I want to be respectful of your time. We're coming to the close here, but I'd like to step back and talk a little bit more on the real estate front, just from a macro perspective. I'm going to ask you to get out your crystal ball here as best as possible. But basically, I wanted to hear your view on where we go from here over the next year or two. Obviously, we're getting tapped out from a monetary stimulus standpoint. I don't think that we can keep interest rates. I mean, we've said this for 5 years, but at a certain point, I feel that, at least with my clients and speaking with individuals, that there's this sense that we keep going down this road and then the debt load will just be too high. So I'm curious, number one, your view on where our economy is heading and the best steps forward and the impact of that on real estate, generally speaking.
So, and now with the advantage of seeing the Liberal budget, which was delivered just yesterday. I think what you've seen over the last 15 months or so is a significant transfer of debt from individual balance sheets to the government balance sheet. And by that, if you look at visa balances, if you look at savings rates, mortgage rates, and so on and so forth, individuals are way better off. And the government's a bit of a framework. Now, the bet the Liberals are making is to say that the revenge rally will be powerful enough to generate the tax revenues to get the ship back in order. And, it remains to be seen. It's not totally wrong. So here's what I see with the revenge rally is that most people, not everybody, most people have spent much less money. Salaried people have earned more or less the same. Those that are rely on working out of the home either been able to do that as an essential worker or they've got crews or other programs. Not perfect. But as a society, there's been massive accumulation of disposable income. And the day that we're told we can get out of jail and go see our friends, our family, our neighbors, our friends, God forbid a hockey game or a concert, people are going to be pretty anxious to do that. And I think out of that will come all sorts of economic activity that will be perhaps quite sharper than people think. As for the monetary drivers, I think central governors are going to be extraordinarily hesitant to do anything. And you've seen in the US, the Fed has said they're moving from an inflation target to an average inflation target. And we don't really know what that means, and they've intended that so you don't really know what it means, so they can be flexible to make those decisions as they go. I think you see, Canada's basically signaled the same thing. So I think that that we obviously that the difficult fiscal time we went through in the early 90s, most of your generation either wasn't there or didn't connect. My generation was there. I was paying 59% tax. I was seeing program cuts. Like I went through all of it. But we did that as Canadians, knowing we had a common objective, which was to balance the budget. And you know what? We did. And then taxes came down. And the period under the, Mulroney set it up with HST, and then Chrétien and
Harper.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, you said Harper.
Managed well. Got Chrétien and Manuel. And then Harper managed all that well. Well, we sort of built up a great balance sheet, and we've squandered it. Now, let's hope that this growth that I'm talking about can help stop the bleeding, and then we'll have to ultimately say we've got to figure out how to right size this thing. I was happy that there wasn't massive tax increases in the latest budget, because all that does is put people back in the foxhole, and it probably doesn't raise much money, but certainly curbs a lot of economic activity. So I'll give the Liberals credit there. And I think the child tax credit is an important initiative, because freeing up spouses to work freely is, I think, a really fundamental thing to get done. So I applaud that. And you know what? It's we're all going to have to work on this together. But the key is vaccines in arms, and let's use everything we can to get it done. And then, why don't we use the great strengths of this country and get interprovincial free trade, energy self-sufficiency, and food self-sufficiency?
For sure. And I guess where we could leave off here is, the future in terms of the Canadian outlook for real estate. Obviously, this has all happened, different verticals in different ways, whether retail, office, industrial, multi-res. Where are the areas that you think there will be opportunities over the next year or two and further as a result of this last 12, 15 months we've been through?
So, the greatest challenge we're facing is we're going to have be more aggressive in competing for immigrants and keeping the ones we have, not just immigrants, keeping all the Canadians we have. So let's not think that's a layer, which it was under the previous U.S. administration. So that's number one. Then if we can achieve our goal of 400,000 new Canadians every year, the vast bulk of whom have skills, jobs, and are contributing, then there'll be a lot of demand for every kind of real estate across the system. So whether you're in residential or industrial or office or retail, there'll be lots of renewed demand. So I think there's opportunities everywhere, and the opportunities largely fit inside someone's experience base. And so I don't think someone should leave their experience base seeking opportunities. They should find opportunities in that base, because once we get back at it, I think you'll see lots of opportunities. Things will be different, but it's mostly trends that were in place anyway, and they're being accelerated. And you know what? It's always different. So that's okay. But Canada's we are such a phenomenal country. We've got so much going for us. And sometimes we have to get out of our way. And if we can really work together so that all Canadians can achieve their potential, we've got a great set of facts.
It's a great place to leave it off. My guest today has been Jon Love. Jon, thanks for being part of Working Capital.
Thanks, Jesse. Have a great day.
You as well.